Today I'm going to be talking about what the future could possibly hold for Bioware, and in fact kind of pose the question, is Bioware doomed after Dragon Age the Veilguard? Now granted, we don't know any sales numbers for this, and even though people want to say, oh, it's probably flopping right now, keep in mind it took over 10 years just to find out that Dragon Age the Inquisition sold 12 million copies. Like, that's another game that it really, I ain't gonna say didn't really light the world on fire in terms of sales. At least not initially. It took a long time just to get to that point. I think they had a Game of the Year edition at one point, so that probably did bolster some sales, as well as being released on Steam. So of course that always helps. Now, according to GameSpot, one of the developers for the Veilguard told them, quote, "The game was never going to live up to fan hype. It's been a decade since the last Dragon Age game came out, and a lot of people have spent that decade imagining various versions of what this game was going to be," said Dragon Age creative director John Eepler during an interview with Eurogamer. "The reality was, whatever we came out with, it was never going to match the Dragon Age 4 in people's minds and people's imaginations. We're very happy with the critical reception of the game," said Bush. "It's not common to have these challenging development cycles have a team turn around and receive critical reception that it did. In fact, in a lot of ways, that's the harder path to take. So yeah, we're quite proud of the critical reception. Unfortunately, on the sales side, that's not something we can really discuss. But of course, as we know with Inquisition, that was a long burn to get to those total sales numbers." And when asked what the future could hold for Dragon Age, he did say this: "There are so many stories left, so many mysteries left unsolved, so I'll leave that for what it is. I will remain of the point of view that Dragon Age's ability to reinvent itself remains our greatest challenge and our greatest opportunity." Now, in terms of the critical reception, maybe in terms of like certain major critics out there, yeah, it got glowing reviews from those people. But in terms of word of mouth or what YouTubers have said about it, is very, I ain't gonna say divisive, but very mixed, where you have some that like it and others that really don't like it. Me, myself, like in the first 10 hours of the game, and I would even say all the way up to like 45, 50 hours, I was having a blast with the game. But then when it got to like that 60th hour and beyond, that's where I felt like I started to see through the cracks with this game. Like seeing the same combat animations over and over, the same finisher animations over and over, looking through a mundane skill tree that has more passive abilities than newer abilities to get to. And I feel like they could have done a better job at doing that whole skill tree in of itself. The romancing felt like I was a elementary kid giving a girl flowers and kind of acting awkwardly. You really couldn't be rude to anybody to save your life. The story had a big pacing issue where there would be this really high moment and you would think, okay, things are really ramping up. You should really be focused on this one particular thing and kind of keep the ball rolling on that. But then after that moment, you'll have a couple quests that are part of the main story that's like, you know, it kind of is one of them quests to kind of get you from point A to point B, but not really memorable as much as that huge moment. And then on top of everything else, with the companions, you really can't speak to them in the first act, which, by the way, that first act is like 40 hours. So yeah. And then the second act, they want to tailor the whole act into getting to know your crew, talking to your companions, make sure they're not distracted so they can be focused when it comes to the final mission of the game, which I feel like the game does not have to tell you that. It literally doesn't. We've played a Bioware game before. We know how this works. You got to do all the side content. If not, you'll get the worst ending possible. We know how this goes. Even for people who may have never played a Bioware game, they can at least know that because of word of mouth. And the whole Tosh stuff, I mean, granted, she was probably the most aggressive character I'll say that you'll meet. Now, granted, I will say this. Tosh is not one of the companions that you have to do her quest line. It's just two other companions you have to do that to, and that's it. The fact you're kind of shoehorned into that is kind of crazy for what it is. Outside of that introduction, you really ain't gotta pay Tosh any mind. You could literally not talk to Tosh at all. Just avoid that character at all costs, unless it's like y'all all sitting down at a table or something like that. But after 60 plus hours, I decided to drop it for all the reasons I just listed. Now, granted, if this was a 45, 50 hour game, I would have said it was pretty good if it had been a lot better paced than what it was. Even if it corrected those issues, it would still have some core fundamental problems, specifically with the dialogue options and the romancing and the companions treating you like I only want to talk to you when I need something and not the other way around. Like I may want to get to know you, but you get the point. And I'm going on this long yap quest about this game simply because does it really instill the utmost confidence moving forward with Bioware? Not really, even though I get it. It's always a different team working on the Mass Effect games and the Dragon Age games. And I'll even have a hot take for this whole thing. I think Mass Effect is Bioware's flagship franchise more so than Dragon Age.
Fool this man!
But the small glimmer of hope that I may cling on to is what Michael Gamble has said in the past in regards to the tone of the game, in regards to them wanting to aim for photorealism, always being what it is. Now, albeit the last Mass Effect game is a mixed bag. I went back to play it recently and it really doesn't age all that well, even for what it is. I mean, granted, the combat still holds up nicely, but it's certain things like the story or parts of the story. I get certain moments that may feel like it's tense, but then at the same time, like you may have certain characters who say certain things it feels out of character, no pun intended. And I'm pretty sure that that whole team that made that game is dissolved by this point. They're off working on whatever they're working on at this point. But as long as the gameplay carries over from Andromeda to this next game, I think we're going to be in pretty safe hands. And even though people could say it's never been about the gameplay, it's always been about the writing or story that we're worried about, which is true, which is why I would hope that at least that BioWare's tried to recruit some talent from Larian Studios who made Baldur's Gate 3, or even go get anybody from CD Projekt Red. I don't care what you have to do. I don't care if you have to recruit these people like they're a 5-star quarterback and you got to pull up in a scat pack and a whole suitcase full of money to kind of convince them, hey, why don't you come over here and help us win? But I think if they were to try to go after talent like that of that magnitude, it would at least instill some faith and hope, or maybe even a little bit of hype for this upcoming game, because all people need to hear is like, oh, a former writer for Baldur's Gate or a former writer for Cyberpunk is working on this game, or even a former quest designer is working on this Mass Effect game, considering how those games were. Now, albeit Cyberpunk had a bunch of technical issues, it was downgraded to hell, it was fundamentally broken on consoles, but even if you get through all that muck, like there's still like a decent game to be found there. If anything, don't hire CD Projekt Red's QA testers. And we all know that this game is gearing up to go in full production at this point. It's kind of giving that all hands on deck at the Bioware studios, and they could be trying to make this game like it could be their last, and it might just be, depending on how it's received and depending on how good it is. I wouldn't be surprised if EA does an EA move, because keep in mind, if you remember a little studio called Ghost Games, they were given 3 chances. The first being Need for Speed Rivals, then Need for Speed 2015, then Need for Speed Payback, which if you ask me, Payback got to be the worst of the 3. And then they came out with a little game called Need for Speed Heat, lit the world on fire, amazing game, sold like crazy, sold like 3-4 million copies, did pretty good for what it was, and then EA decided to close them. And the reason for it, or the excuse, was relocation issues at the time. But there's no way you close a studio like that of that magnitude after releasing that good of a game. And it's crazy, the first 3 games that they put out were either okay or decent, and they were allowed to be open, and they still made around the same money that Need for Speed Heat made. And I kind of bring them up to kind of pose the question, imagine if we get everything we want from this Mass Effect game. Let's say it don't light the world on fire, but it has great word of mouth, everybody's talking about it, everybody's having a great time with the game, it's getting like a must play stamp of approval on Metacritic, even though that hasn't happened for a Bioware game since what, Mass Effect 3. And all the YouTube critics will end up giving glowing reviews, and even people who are kind of skeptical may even have their own favorite reviewers seeing that game's praises. And let's say also that game sells out the wazoo because of said positive word of mouth, and then EA decides to go with Bioware. And even though that may sound crazy if things were to play out like that, but we've seen this happen before with Ghost Games, and it could leave a lot of people scratching their heads like, wait, you gave them all the opportunities in the world after Andromeda, after Anthem, and after the Veilguard, but once this Mass Effect game comes out and everybody likes it for what it is, you close them? I'm not saying that's a certain thing that will happen, but it might happen after this Mass Effect game comes out, because I don't see them getting shut down anytime soon or before this, because the money's already spent and the investment is already made. And if I had to guess, probably a combined $500,000 has been invested in not only this Mass Effect game, but Dragon Age the Veilguard, which if you do the math, that's like $250 a piece. And I'll let y'all take it from there. And granted, I don't know shit, I'm just estimating, because I can't see a budget for either one of them games be more than 250 million. But there is a couple things that they could also do with this upcoming Mass Effect game that I think would be very interesting. Let's say, if, hear me out on this, if they change the perspective from third to first person and you have a silent protagonist. And the reason why I say that is something that's never been done for a Mass Effect game before. And we've seen other first person RPGs that have taken the silent protagonist approach that have lit the world on fire. You look at Fallout New Vegas, you look at Outer Worlds, you even look at Skyrim, RPGs that were in first person that had a silent protagonist that everybody end up thoroughly enjoying. And also, I'd be remiss to forget that Avowed is coming out sometime soon. Now, the jury is still out if that game will be good, but considering Obsidian's track record, I think a lot of people would be looking forward to it, considering that they know how to craft RPGs. They did it with Outer Worlds, they did it with other RPGs in the past. Why wouldn't I think that they'll end up knocking this one out the park? Now, I think if anything, they'll be able to sell Avowed on the basis of choice and RPG mechanics of the game and the story, and not necessarily from a combat standpoint or even a frame rate standpoint, because that frame rate is atrocious. I get it, the whole artistic style that they want to go with, but yeah, I think if that game was running at 60 frames and up, okay, now we cooking. But that would be another RPG that people got to keep their close eye on and see that if Bioware could also take some inspiration from Obsidian. I hope that is a banger for Xbox, and that is something that could really have a lot of people talking about the game and maybe want people to be invested in that game. Now, albeit it's going through its own fair share of controversy right now, but hopefully cooler heads will prevail. And also, I think that something that would be interesting to see, there is this upcoming RPG that's being made by ex-Bioware staff called Exodus. Now, I know that there's like some controversy going on with half of that studio being Wizards of the Coast, but with that little something that's being made by former RPG staff, it would be very interesting to see how that comes to fruition when they end up releasing the game. It is slated for release sometime late next year, but they wouldn't be surprised if it got pushed back into 2026. And I think 2026 would be a sweet spot to release that game, because let's say that's when this new Mass Effect game comes out the same year. And ideally speaking, I would like it if, let's say, Exodus game comes out sometime in the spring and the next Mass Effect comes out in the fall. That way we can compare the two RPGs. But yeah, with that would be like a wait and see approach if that ends up happening. But with that being said, y'all let me know what you think about this in the comments below. Till next time, I'll see y'all in the next video. Peace.